You know, sometimes you have those hunts where it's like great the whole time, and then you tag out and it was just like, boy, we knew this was going to happen. And then you have those hunts that are just bad the entire time, and you don't tag out and you're like, I knew that was going to happen. But then there's those hunts that, you know, they start out like good and then they get bad, and then you have like a glimmer of hope in the middle, and that's kind of how this was. This is the hunt recap for North Dakota. What's up, everyone? Welcome to an all-new hunt recap. And this time, we're talking about North Dakota. Now, this trip involves Greg Miller, Matt Tandy, John Goldsberry, and myself. We had 3 tags between the 4 of us. I was going to be a cameraman full-time. John had a tag, Greg had a tag, and Matt had a tag. And between Greg and Matt, Greg would hunt first. When he tagged out, Matt would hunt. Greg would run camera. Unless John had tagged out, then I would run camera. This is super confusing, I know, but we had it all figured out. Now, this trip took place around the end of August through the first week of September, but it actually started back farther than that. So the season opened on August 31st, but 3 weeks prior to that, Greg and Matt went out and put up some Banks feeders, some Reconyx cameras, some big tine blocks all over this property. This is a 7,500 acre property with a mix of agriculture and river bottom and sandhills. So anywhere that there wasn't livestock, being cattle or sheep, they put out feeders, cameras, big tine blocks to try and take inventory of the bucks on this property. Now, when we came back a few weeks later, right before the season started, we had some target bucks, we had some optimism, but we didn't feel like everything was at the level we thought it would be when we got back. And sometimes things just take some fine tuning. There was cattle in some places that we didn't think there were, and that kind of, altered deer activity. Also, between when Greg and Matt went out and when we came back, the acorns had started dropping. I can't even explain to you how many acorns were dropping. You couldn't sit anywhere near an oak tree without it sounding like it was raining. So that changed things a little bit. Now, Greg and Matt were focusing on areas where the deer were transitioning from the sandhills to the agriculture. Now, John and I went deeper into the sandhills to try and figure out a spot where these deer were congregating mostly around these larger groves of oaks. Now, we started out on a power line cut, and we'd had success there in past years. It's a natural deer travel route. You can see a lot from up there too, so it's almost as good of a scouting hunt as it is a hunting hunt. Our first sit there, we definitely got bombarded by cattle. We did see some bucks after that, and some good bucks, but the longer we were there, the more the cattle started to congregate in that area. We couldn't walk in without them seeing us, and then they just want to hang around us because they're stupid and they think we're going to feed them, and we're not. We're going to feed them an arrow with a broadhead on it and have ribeyes for the rest of the trip. Anyway, I'm upset. I'm sorry. So after a couple of days of that, John and I realized that we were not going to be in the money anymore, and we decided to take a little walk. Now, after a little bit of walking, we found a few groves of oak trees that had a lot of fresh deer sign in it, and we knew that if we put out a Reconyx and some big tine, we'd have inventory of everything in that area. Now, after we set that camera up, our plan was to not go back in there for a couple days and continue hunting around all the stupid cattle. Meanwhile, Greg and Matt didn't have the cattle issues that we did, but they were finding that the deer were behaving just a little bit more erratic than they expected. And I think it had a lot to do with the acorns. Because they weren't taking the same routes out to the primary food source because they could eat acorns the whole way out, their travel routes were a little bit different, and they were a lot more random. Now, eventually, Greg and Matt were able to hone in on an alfalfa field that a lot of the deer were using more frequently than a lot of the other food sources. They set up a camera and a blind, and they just waited until they got some good Reconyx activity before they were going to make a move out to that spot. Now, in the meantime, we'd been getting pictures of a pretty good buck back in the river bottom. This buck's rack was not indicative of his age. His body was giant. His rack was so-so, but he had a lot of mass. He had a big, deep chest and shoulders and a big neck, and we knew that he was a mature deer. He was daylight active, and at this point in the hunt, after a few days, that was the most important thing to us, was daylight activity. These early season hunts are tricky because you know that if you can get the job done early, it's for the better. But if you can't, it's not like the rut where your spots could just get better every day because a hot doe could come through or the bucks could be cruising. There's not a lot of cruising going on early season. So the deeper we got into the trip, after 3 days of hunting and nobody so much as lifting their bow off the hanger, we kind of got a little concerned. So a couple days go by and John and I decided to go check our camera, and bam, there's a buck, our target buck, our new number one. We went right back in there. We hung tree stands and got set up, and we hunted that evening. And Greg decided to go back and go after the buck in the river bottom that had been daylight active. So our first sit was okay in our new spot. We saw quite a few deer, more deer activity than we had been seeing, but we knew that as long as we had the right wind, we felt great about our spot, and it was just a matter of time. In the meantime, Greg didn't have to worry about if he was in the right spot or not anymore, because he tagged out that evening and boom, we had one on the board. It was fantastic. It took a lot of the pressure off, and suddenly the whole mood in camp just changed. Next day, John and I went and checked our camera again overnight, and that buck had been in there. Unfortunately, the wind was supposed to be a little bit different, and we didn't want to risk sitting in that spot and messing anything up. So we basically burned a sit at a ground blind that had been getting increasingly worse as time went on, and we saw a doe and her fawn, and the doe was acting like a real and she blew at us a lot, and I don't like that noise. I don't like that noise. I know there's a lot of times when I've had deer blow at me and then a couple minutes goes by and you see more deer or a big buck or something, but it bothers me. It drives me crazy. But halfway through that sit, I get a text message and I look at it, and sure enough, it's a video from Matt, and he's hunting, and it's a video of a big buck walking through the viewfinder on the video camera, and I don't exactly know what happened because they didn't confirm it, because they're like that and they don't, they like to leave you hanging. But I was pretty certain that we had two down on the ground now, and that felt even better than one. So the next day, second to the last day, John and I go check our cameras again, and our buck is still there, and he's earlier. He still hasn't been daylight active yet, but we also have more bucks moving into this spot. And with more bucks comes more competition and a better chance for daylight activity. So with Greg and Matt tagged out, John and I are the only ones in camp that still have a tag. Obviously I'm filming, I don't have a tag. I wish I'd had a tag because there's so many big bucks there, but I didn't have a tag. We climbed into our stand that evening with a high level of optimism. And it didn't take long, and we had some does and fawns moving through. And it wasn't much after that, I look up and I see a big velvet monster. Just keep in mind, this is like over an hour before dark. This is like 45 minutes or more before sunset. This buck hadn't been on these cameras anytime anywhere near daylight. Like, he was flirting with the line maybe one evening, and that's what we had been drawing optimism from. But this was I was not prepared for this at all. This time we get to send the text message that was successful, and it felt pretty darn good. Obviously, Greg and Matt have been doing this for a long time, but I had a great time hanging out with them and having John Goldsberry in camp too. It was just a good time. It was a good, solid hunt. And again, filling 3 tags helps. It really helps boost your positive memories of a trip. But I hope we get a chance to do it again soon. On a side note, how wacky is it that the last buck that we shoot on a 7-day hunt is the only one that's still in velvet? John's buck was the only one that was still in velvet. That's pretty unheard of, I mean, the other 2 bucks were hardhorn, both mature bucks, and John's buck was still in full velvet. I think that's pretty darn cool. Well, that'll do it for this hunt recap. Make sure you tune in next time when I explain why hunting for beavers is the best strategy for killing big whitetails.